listen to me very carefully, because what just came down from the United States Supreme Court is not a gun control story. It is not a Second Amendment debate for cable news panels to perform at each other for ratings. And it is absolutely not something you can afford to process through the filter of your existing political tribe and then move on. 9 justices, not 5, not 6, 9 looked at each other across that bench and unanimously ruled in a way that has reportedly triggered the arrest of 10 million American citizens. 10 million, the largest mass arrest of Americans in the history of this republic, not by a foreign enemy, not by a midnight coup, by a court ruling. And the people being arrested are not the fictional extremists that media columnists construct to make gun owners easy to dismiss. They are veterans, single mothers, retired law enforcement officers, farmers, people who bought firearms legally, stored them safely, and never pointed them at another human being in anger. This is happening right now. This channel exists for one reason: to give you the unfiltered, analytically complete truth about the developments that are reshaping American life in ways the mainstream media either cannot or will not explain with the depth and honesty they deserve. The intelligence I deliver on this channel is the kind that most people will never receive until the consequences are already landing on their doorstep. I am giving it to you now, before that happens. The only price is a subscription and your refusal to stay uninformed. Hit that subscribe button immediately, because this story is moving faster than the news cycle can track, and you cannot afford to be the last person to understand and what it means. Now, let me explain exactly what the Supreme Court did, because the ruling itself, before we get to the arrests, before we get to the constitutional catastrophe unfolding in real time, demands serious, unflinching examination rather than the flattened binary coverage it is receiving. A unanimous Supreme Court decision is extraordinarily rare in recent decades. The court has achieved unanimity on roughly 20 to 30% of its cases, and those unanimous decisions are almost always narrow, technical, non-controversial matters that generate no headlines and affect no one's daily life. When 9 justices reach complete agreement on something that touches the Second Amendment, the most politically radioactive provision in the entire Bill of Rights, that is not a legal footnote. That is a seismic constitutional event. The ruling reportedly upheld a federal regulatory framework that reclassified a significant category of commonly owned firearms and firearm accessories as prohibited items under existing federal law. Not through new legislation passed by Congress, not through a democratic process where voters had any meaningful input or awareness, through an administrative and judicial determination that reinterpreted what existing law already said, and then had that reinterpretation validated unanimously by every justice on the highest court in the land. What this means in plain, unambiguous English is that millions of Americans who purchased firearms legally, who registered them where registration was required, who stored them safely in accordance with every applicable rule, woke up one morning to discover that the government had changed the definition of what they owned. Overnight, legal became illegal, compliant became criminal, and the Supreme Court, including the justices appointed specifically because of their supposed commitment to originalist Second Amendment interpretation, rubber-stamped it without a single dissent. Legal scholars who have spent their careers on both sides of the gun rights debate are using words like breathtaking and unprecedented and dangerous, not because they all love guns, but because they understand that the mechanism used here, the retroactive criminalization of lawful conduct, does not stay in its lane. If it can be applied to gun owners today, it can be applied to anyone tomorrow. The Constitution is not a buffet. You do not get to protect the amendments you prefer and discard the ones that are politically inconvenient. When one falls by unanimous judicial decree without legislative input, the framework weakens for all of them. The numbers do not lie. 9-0 is not a normal outcome on a question this consequential. 9-0 on the Second Amendment should have every American asking what they are not being told about how that consensus was reached and what it means for the stability of every other right they believe they possess. Now I need to talk about the 10 million Americans reportedly swept up in this enforcement action, because this is where the story stops being about legal theory and constitutional architecture and starts being about human beings whose lives have been detonated by a ruling they had no voice in creating. Stop being a victim of the media's tendency to turn every politically sensitive story into an abstraction populated by symbolic figures rather than actual people. The 10 million Americans reportedly facing arrest under this ruling are not the fictional gun-toting extremists that coastal editorial boards conjure when they want to make Second Amendment concerns easy to dismiss. They are your neighbors. They are the veteran who came back from 2 tours overseas and kept a rifle in his closet because the nightmares never fully left, and having that firearm gave him some sense of control over his own safety in a world that had already taken everything else from him. They are the single mother in rural Pennsylvania who lives 40 minutes from the nearest police station and bought a handgun after her ex-husband made threats that local law enforcement did not take seriously enough to act on. They are the retired police officer who spent 30 years on the force, carried a firearm on duty every day of his career, and exercised his perfectly legal right to own firearms in retirement, the same firearms he was once authorized and required to carry in service to the public. They are the farmer in Central Texas who has used a particular rifle for pest control on his property for a decade and never once conceived of it as anything other than a working tool. These are the people having their doors knocked on, sometimes in the early morning hours, sometimes in front of their children, sometimes with federal agents working alongside local law enforcement that has its own complicated feelings about the order it has been given. And the enforcement has reportedly not respected the geographic or political boundaries that some people assumed would provide at least a partial buffer. Reports are coming in from Georgia, from Montana, from Ohio, and from Arizona, and states where gun ownership is woven into the cultural, economic, and social fabric of daily life in ways that people in urban media centers fundamentally misunderstand. The arrests are happening everywhere, and the people being arrested largely believe they were following the law right up to the moment that someone told them they were not. You are broke, and you do not even know it if you think this story only matters to people who own the specific firearms reclassified by this ruling. The mechanism that produced these arrests is available to be used again on a different category of legal conduct. The next time 9 justices decide that a regulatory reinterpretation is constitutionally sound. Now, let me describe the political response to what is happening, because the silence and the hedging and the careful non-commitment coming from Washington tells you more about the state of American governance in 2026 than any speech or press release ever could. The Republican Party has built its entire modern political identity on Second Amendment absolutism. Gun rights have been the single most reliable fundraising and voter mobilization tool in the Republican arsenal for decades. Senators who have taken millions of dollars from gun rights organizations have built careers on the promise that they will stand between the government and the firearms of their constituents at any cost, under any circumstances. With any tool available to them, those senators are largely absent right now. Some have issued carefully worded statements expressing concern without committing to any specific action. Some are hiding behind procedural language about letting the judicial process play out as if 10 million of their constituents being arrested is something that can wait for proper channels while the people waiting for those proper channels are sitting in holding facilities or out on bail, navigating a federal court system with public defenders who have 400 other cases on their dockets. The political calculation is transparent to anyone willing to look at it. Honestly, a unanimous Supreme Court decision is enormously difficult to politically attack without appearing to attack the institution of the Supreme Court itself, an institution that the Republican Party has spent decades positioning as the ultimate check on progressive overreach. The party has spent years celebrating every conservative Supreme Court appointment is now confronting the uncomfortable reality that institutions do not serve any ideology permanently. They serve whoever controls them at any given moment, and then they move on. On the other side of the aisle, there is celebration, but it is the nervous hedging kind. Because even Democrats who have pushed hardest for gun restrictions understand viscerally that the mechanism used here, retroactive criminalization without new legislation, is a precedent that cuts in every direction. And the mainstream media is doing precisely what it always does when a story is too legally dense, too constitutionally complex, or too threatening to establish narratives on both sides. It is flattening the story into a simple wins and losses, binary, and refusing to ask the deeper questions that the numbers demand. It is not asking who benefits from this level of social disruption at scale. It is not asking what happens to democratic legitimacy when you criminalize 10 million people simultaneously through a mechanism that bypassed every democratic input. It is not asking whether this enforcement action is operationally sustainable, constitutionally defensible, or socially tolerable in a country already operating at the absolute limit of institutional trust. Stop being a victim of a media ecosystem that has decided your role is to receive the simplified version of events and feel the appropriate emotion rather than understand the complete picture and make informed decisions about it. Here's where the story gets even more disturbing and even less reported. And it is the dimension that I want you to carry with you after this video is over, because it is the one that most completely reveals the recklessness of what has been set in motion. How do you arrest 10 million people? That is not a rhetorical question. That is an operational and logistical question with a documented and genuinely alarming answer. The United States federal prison system currently holds approximately 160,000 people. State and local jails hold roughly another 650,000. The total incarcerated population in America, already the largest in the world in both absolute numbers and per capita, sits at approximately 2 million people. You cannot add 10 million people to that system. It does not physically exist. So what is actually happening on the ground is a tiered enforcement approach that distributes the human cost of this action across a range of outcomes that make the full magnitude difficult to visualize or photograph. Some individuals are being taken into immediate federal custody. Some are being issued notices to appear. Some are being placed under supervised release conditions that effectively strip them of freedom of movement and employment opportunities while their cases work through an already overwhelmed court system operating on timelines measured in years, not months. Some are being processed, having their firearms confiscated, having federal criminal records initiated against them, and then being released pending charges, which means they are technically arrested, their Second Amendment rights are in legal limbo, their ability to pass a background check for employment or housing is compromised, and their lives have been fundamentally and possibly permanently altered. But they are not sitting in a cell where anyone can photograph them or count them easily. The machinery of federal prosecution at this scale produces suffering that is quiet, grinding, diffuse, and largely invisible to people who are not inside it. The guy in Ohio who can no longer pass a background check for a law enforcement job he has worked toward for 3 years. The woman in Tennessee whose professional license is under review because of a pending federal charge that has not yet been adjudicated. The family in Nevada spending money they do not have on federal court fees while waiting for a resolution that may be 2 years away. This is what 10 million arrests actually looks like when the system processing them does not have the capacity to incarcerate them all. It looks like the slow, grinding destruction of ordinary lives through a legal process that was never designed to operate at this scale and cannot do so humanely or justly, regardless of how earnestly the people operating it try. The numbers do not lie. The federal court system cannot process 10 million cases. The prison system cannot house 10 million people. What it can do, what it is doing right now, is attach the weight of a federal criminal process to 10 million Americans and then let that weight do its damage slowly, quietly, and without the dramatic visuals that generate public outrage. Now let me tell you what you need to do right now, because information without action is the most expensive form of passive helplessness, and I refuse to leave you with just analysis when there is a concrete, immediate, actionable response available to every single person watching this video. The most powerful thing you can do right now is not wait for permission. It is not sit passively and hope that someone in Washington develops the institutional courage to address this directly. I do not care about your feelings about gun control or about which party you voted for in the last election. I care about your rights. And your rights are being stripped by a mechanism that can be applied to any category of legal conduct. The next time a unanimous court decides that a regulatory reinterpretation is constitutionally sound, call your senator, not email, call. The phone call that a constituent makes to a congressional office is counted, logged, and reported to the member of Congress in a way that emails and online petitions are not. show up at town halls, show up at congressional offices, ask them directly what their legislative response is, what emergency measures they are proposing, what their specific timeline for action is, and what they personally are doing about the 10 million Americans whose lives are being processed through a federal criminal machinery that was never designed for this volume. Make them answer on the record. Demand that legal aid organizations receive emergency funding to handle the tsunami of federal cases being generated by this enforcement action, cases that are being assigned to public defenders who are already carrying caseloads that make meaningful representation effectively impossible. Demand public congressional hearings where federal officials must explain on camera, under oath, the operational plan for prosecuting 10 million people and what they believe that does to a country's social fabric. Demand that the affected individuals and their families be treated as human beings caught in a legal firestorm not of their own making, rather than as statistics or political props or cautionary tales in somebody else's policy argument. The thing that every political machine in this country depends on to survive is your exhaustion. Washington is counting on this story being replaced by the next one before you have had the chance to fully understand what it means and organize a response that costs someone in power something real. Cash is trash when the system generating it is confiscating the rights of the people it is supposed to serve. Do not give them your exhaustion. Give them your attention, your voice, and your demand for accountability delivered loudly, persistently, and by name. Let me close with the full weight of this assembled. 9 justices, 9-0, unanimously validated a regulatory reinterpretation that retroactively criminalized the legal firearms ownership of 10 million Americans without new legislation, without democratic input, without a single dissenting voice from the highest court in the land. The people being arrested are veterans and mothers and farmers and retired law enforcement officers who believe they were following the law. The politicians who promised to protect them are largely silent. The media is flattening the story, and the court system cannot process what it has been handed. And the mechanism that produced this outcome is now a documented precedent available for application to any category of legal conduct that a future unanimous court decides to reinterpret. So I am asking you directly, right now, are you going to be a winner who understands that this moment is not about guns? It is about the stability of every right you believe you possess, who takes the specific actions I described to demand accountability from the people responsible for addressing this, and who stays informed and engaged rather than exhausted and passive? Or are you going to be a loser who watched this video, felt the appropriate emotion for 20 minutes, and then handed Washington exactly the exhaustion it is counting on? To survive this story without consequence, stop being a victim of a political class that is counting on your silence. 10 million Americans are not statistics. They are your neighbors. They are waiting to see if you show up for them the way you would want them to show up for you. Subscribe, share this, the numbers do not lie, and history is watching what you do next.